On page 436 of your textbook, Mann introduces the area of race theory, and he starts out by looking at the general principles of race theory. So he talks about, he writes, since the late 1960s, race, gender, and sexual orientation have become hot button issues not only in the academy, but in the wider world, as seen in the US civil rights movement, second wave feminism, and in the struggle for gay rights. And as you will all know, in the contemporary period, this has become one of the key controversies of the time, and there's been a lot of pushback against things like critical race theory, and I would say more so in the United States than in Canada, but nonetheless, it's influential everywhere. And so we hear this idea of cancel culture and so on, pushing back against queer theory, race theory, feminism. So he starts out by talking about the idea of scientifically categorizing human beings, and we've looked at a bit at this in sociobiology and how dangerous this can be in terms of with gender and with race if we start attributing some essential biological essence to these categories. So he talks about the ideas of the French doctor Francois Bernier in 1684 with the first comprehensive categorization of human races, and then Linnaeus's natural system of 1735. So he's not really contextualizing this because this is highly political, and it's very important to also understand it historically, that the whole concept of race really emerges out of the colonial period, and where the European powers are coming into conflict with different territories that they're trying to colonize, and also through the Atlantic slave trade. So prior to that, as I think I talked about in the very beginning of the course, certainly Europe would have divided the world up very differently. It would have been more along the line of religiously, so the idea of Christendom and then the Muslim world. So race really only emerges as a category after the beginning of European colonization in the 16th century and beyond. So he says there is a long tradition of quote-unquote scientific theories explaining why one race is intellectually, morally, or aesthetically superior to the other. So again, we really need to problematize here this idea of science, and we've talked about this throughout the course, the way that using the word science immediately is meant to mean objective, and you can't argue with it because it's based in objective fact and so on. So if we apply that to race, we're going to get into a lot of trouble. So this is almost always, these theories are used to bolster white supremacy. So as he says, associated with colonialism and fascism. And so he looks at the idea of the new race theory shares a number of core assumptions. First, it argues that strong racial prejudice has existed and continues to exist in some form, and that such prejudice is bad. Second, postmodern race theory argues that race as a category was created and developed in order to buttress European colonialism and imperialism, along with the associated institution of slavery in Europe and the Americas. Okay, so that's the one I'm going to be focusing on. So he says, fourth, race theory usually argues that the idea of race is a social construction. So these are the theories that I'm going to be building out here. Now, obviously, I'm just picking a few key figures, but there are many others as well. I want to turn now to W.E.B. Du Bois, who is a foundational figure in race theory. And unsurprisingly, many of these theorists are tied to activism, as we've seen already in this course for many of them, or at least to wanting to have impact politically. And so with Du Bois, this is very clear. His whole life, he was an activist, as Mann writes in your textbook. He sought civil rights for Black Americans, including college education, fair and full employment, the right to organize labor unions, freedom of speech, and the right to vote. So he is a key figure that also leads into the civil rights movement and beyond. He was also a member of the Pan-African movement and spent time in Africa. So that was sort of another aspect of this larger movement. of tying the Black diaspora back to Africa. So he was born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, and became the greatest American social theorist of race. So he studied at Fisk University, then attended Harvard, where he received his PhD in 1895, and then he went on to study in Germany. So one of his first research projects was an ethnographic study of Black life in the United States called The Philadelphia Negro, published in 1899. So it's been noted that Du Bois is often left out of the narrative of sociology, so it's fairly recent. He's being put back into his proper place in the kind of canon of social theory. So part of the reason for this, besides racism, was that he brings in history, fiction, and essays. And we've seen many of the great sociologists do this. They don't just do sociology. They bring in all the other disciplines. So his most famous work is Souls of Black Folk, which was published in 1903. And it's been noted that he had a lifelong debate going with Booker T. Washington, who was then the dominant spokesperson for Black Americans. Booker T. Washington felt that that Black Americans should basically get educated in the trades, and so not to be too threatening, if we want to put it that way. Du Bois was completely opposed to this. He wanted full, free citizenship for all Black Americans. And so he helped found the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, and was active in this group most of his life. So we can see that activist strain in his work, that's always what he's committed to, is improving the lives of actual people and using sociological ethnographic study and writing to do that. This excerpt is from the Souls of Black Folk. It is folk, not folks, as is in your textbook. I double-checked that. And this is a very, very important concept that gets used by many different thinkers of double consciousness. So he writes, the Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with second sight in this American world. A world which yields no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. So he's using very poetical language about the gifts. So he's sort of presenting it in a certain way as a gift. People who are born with a veil are believed to have second sight, or kind of a psychic insight in folk culture. And so he's applying this to Black Americans and saying you can see things that other people can't see. And this is common knowledge that if someone's in a minority, they're able to see the dynamics, the power dynamics of society that can be invisible to people that have more power in that society. So he's saying that the world itself yields no true self-consciousness for people in a minority. So you're constantly seeing yourself through the eyes of others. And this can be happen in a variety of ways. So we talk about this in the idea of how are you depicted in media? How are you depicted in advertising? How is your culture presented in academia? How is it presented in sociology, for instance, or is it just not presented? So he goes on to say, it is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others. So this is part of the idea that you have your own sense of yourself, but you're also very aware constantly of how the world sees you, and in this case, often in a very negative way, of measuring one's soul by the tape of the world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings. So there's this innate tension in maintaining this doubleness, but also a kind of gift, as I said, of being able to see things that other people can't see. So he goes on to say, the history of the American Negro is the history of this strife, this longing to attain self-conscious manhood, to merge his double self into a better and truer self. In this merging, he wishes neither of the older selves to be lost. He would not Africanize America, for America has too much to teach the world. he would not bleach his Negro soul in the flood of white Americanism, for he knows that Negro blood has a message for the world. He simply wishes to make it possible for a man to be both a Negro and an American without being cursed and spit upon by his fellows, without having the doors of opportunity closed roughly in his face. So here he's setting out his agenda. So the idea that he's not asking for anything unattainable. He's just simply asking that Black Americans have equal opportunity to white Americans. I want to turn now to the work of Cornel West, who is a philosopher and scholar of African American studies and also religion. And he's written a number of very influential books, including Race Matters in 1993. And he was born in Oklahoma, and then the family moved to California. And he was very influenced by Baptist religion. He sometimes says his influences are Christianity and the Black Panther Party, which is a radical Black political movement. So he entered Harvard at age 17 and eventually got a PhD in 1980. And then he went on to teach philosophy, religion, and African American studies. So Cornel West is a very original thinker, and he's been involved in a number of controversies. Partly because he's bringing together so many different schools of thought. So in your textbook, Mann includes a chart which I think is actually helpful here. And he critiques different philosophical schools and the way they approach African American oppression. So for instance, he looks at Marxist views and notes that Marxists' obsession with economics comes from an industrial age which values control and dominance over nature. In other words, it's not just about class, but ideas also. So I touched on this earlier with Bernie Sanders, so Cornel West is going beyond just a strictly Marxist view or a conservative view or a liberal view. He's creating his own kind of eclectic thought. He's also been very involved politically. He's set himself up to run as a political candidate. And as I said, he was involved in a controversy while he was teaching, because he was told that he was spending too much time in being political. So he then switched to teaching at Princeton. So one thing I will say about Cornel West is he's actually extremely popular in the mainstream. So I've talked about this a few times with people throughout this course where it's very rare for an academic to break through and sell a lot of books or be known in the mainstream. And Cornel West is one of these people. So just to give you an example, there was a conference, the Congress that happens every year in Canada, and he was speaking at MTU, and I went with a colleague, and we couldn't get in. It was standing room only. There was no room. So he's somebody who's actually extremely popular, and it's partly because he's such a engaging speaker. So he's been embroiled in controversy both within his own community and outside, but he is definitely part of that tradition of the publicly engaged intellectual. I want to look now at an excerpt from The New Cultural Politics of Difference by Cornel West, and you'll hear echoes of Du Bois here in the work. Furthermore, Black cultural workers must investigate and interrogate the other of Blackness, whiteness. So interesting language there, Black cultural workers. So West is very interested in Black culture of all kinds, including music. So he talks about hip hop. He talks about it in all these writers and all these aspects, not just in terms of sociology or philosophy. So he says we must interrogate the other. So again, we're seeing that idea of the other, so where Blackness is created as the other. One cannot deconstruct the binary oppositional logic of images of Blackness without extending it to the contrary condition of Blackness, whiteness. So he's saying that this has been set up as a binary of black and white. So this is invented out of the context of a very specific history, and that you can only understand these two concepts in relation to one another. They co-create each other. Social theory is what is needed to examine and explain the historically specific ways in which whiteness is politically constructed, a politically constructed category parasitic on blackness. Okay, so he's saying this is where social theory can help us make sense of this cultural construct, and the way that we talked about this in terms of gender, the way the man has to be intellectual, the woman has to be emotional, creating these binaries of this kind. And so he's relating this also to the idea of there have been a number of works such as, and people will just talk about this colloquially, of when the Irish became white, when the Jews became white. So what we see historically is these groups were seen as not white for a long period of time for various reasons, whether it was religious differences or whatever. But over time, at least within the American context, they began to be seen as white. So using that dynamic of showing the way in which this is an invented category and it has very certain meanings and it allows for certain kinds of cultural power and cultural privilege. I want to turn now to the work of Michelle Alexander, who's a lawyer and a legal scholar and a civil rights activist. And this book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colored Blindness, is one of the most important books of the last 20 years or so. And so this, when I read this, it sent a chill down my spine. She just makes this ironclad argument. So on the website for a book, it says that the best-selling book that helped transform the national debate on racial and criminal justice in the United States. So this is a case of where a book actually changed policy and changed policy around incarceration. Not just her, there are many, many prison activists in the United States, but this work was a fundamental way that people could show the argument and make the argument. And this has this influence, for instance, President Obama, who made it part of his program to bring down the rates of incarcerations. Many of you will know that the United States, it still has one of the highest incarceration rates in the world. At one time, it was the number one in the world, which is, on the face of it, very strange. And the fact that so many minorities are represented in that imprisoned population. So this book became a bestseller. And in the beginning of the book, she talks about the way she came to the topic, which was she was already a community activist and acting as a lawyer in civil rights cases, but she was seeing posters for talks in her neighborhood, and she went, and it was about people in the community who had brothers or sons who were incarcerated, and so this set her on the path of looking at it from a kind of a larger historical perspective. And so it says, the unforgettable argument that we have not ended racial caste in America, we have merely redesigned it. Okay, and she won the NAACP Image Award for 2011 and she's become kind of a cultural figure talking about these ideas. So I'll look at it more closely in the next slide, but this idea that the title tells it all. So we talk about the Jim Crow South, in which there was complete racial segregation. And so the sort of narrative is that after the civil rights movement, this was all dismantled. But what she's saying is that, in fact, it's just been remade, and now people are incarcerated with the same effect. In the preface to The New Jim Crow, Alexander writes, "This book is not for everyone. I have a specific audience in mind. People who care deeply about racial justice, but who for any number of reasons do not yet appreciate the magnitude of the crisis faced by communities of color as a result of mass incarceration. In other words, I'm writing this book for people like me, the person I was 10 years ago. I'm also writing it for another audience, those who have been struggling to persuade their friends, neighbors, relatives, teachers, coworkers, or political representatives that something is eerily familiar about the way our criminal justice system operates, something that looks and feels a lot like an era we supposedly left behind, but have lacked the facts and data to back up the claims." So she's basically writing this specifically to put it into the hands of activists and people who are trying to change the situation, and which she was very successful at doing. So she writes in, she opens up in this very riveting way in the introduction. Jarvius Cotton cannot vote. Like his father, grandfather, great-grandfather, and great-great-grandfather, he has been denied the right to participate in our electoral democracy. Cotton's family tree tells the story of several generations of black men who were born in the United States, but who were denied the most basic freedom that democracy promises, the freedom to vote, for those who will make the rules and the laws that govern one's life. Cotton's great-great-grandfather could not vote as a slave. His great-grandfather was beaten to death by the Ku Klux Klan for attempting to vote. His grandfather was prevented from voting by Klan intimidation. His father was barred from voting by poll taxes and literacy tests. Today, Jarvius Cotton cannot vote because he, like many black men in the United States, has been labeled a felon and is currently on parole. So she sets up the whole book here through the life of this one family and how all the men in the family for generations have been unable to vote. So she's saying the mechanisms of that might be different, but the outcome is identical. And so she writes on page 7, it might be surprising to some that drug crime was declining, not rising, when a drug war was declared. From a historical perspective, however, the lack of correlation between crime and punishment is nothing new. And so we've talked about this idea that what's labeled as deviance, sociology has participated in that in some cases, in labeling certain cultures and subcultures deviant, and then you can punish them. And so Foucault could also be brought into this, the way that societies control certain people's bodies and even their thought and speech. And so this is a fact that, as she said, some people aren't aware of, or they don't want to be aware of, that when they declared the drug war in the 1980s, the crime was declining. And this is something that we see in the rhetoric of certain political groups in Canada as well, this sort of tough on crime. So you can say, I have tried, you can say to these people till you run out of breath that actually crime is declining. They will not accept that fact. So this you can see is ideological. And so I would also bring in here that the war on drugs, which was an actual war, which she talks about, the way that American police forces were using military equipment and SWAT teams to go in and do drug busts in a very violent way, made it like being at war with their own people. And so, which is going on again right now. And so we also see that you could use the analysis of moral panic here. And some of you may have been following, Hillary Clinton was being called to task on this for using words like super predator, these very frightening terms to use about young men. And so to frighten people and make them think, drugs are destroying everybody. And so we have to take this violent measure. So sociologists have frequently observed that governments use punishment primarily as a tool of social control, and thus the extent and severity of punishment is often unrelated to crime pattern. And she goes into obviously a lot of detail in the book, comparing rates of white drug use and black use, and then how black populations are punished completely differently. So she also talks about, beginning in the 1980s, the skyrocketing rates of incarceration. So going from 350,000 to 2.3 million. So millions of people. And so at one point, as she uses the statistics, 1 in 3 black men were in some form either on parole or within the prison system. So, and this gets into a whole other category of private prisons, right, where it becomes also tied into making money and capitalism. And so private prisons want harsher sentences. They want prisoners because it's their business. So she says, few would guess that our prison population leapt from approximately 350,000 to 2.3 million in such a short period of time due to changes in laws and policies, not changes in crime rates. Yet it has been changes in our laws, particularly the dramatic increase in the length of prison sentences, that have been responsible for the growth of our prison system, not increases in crime. One study suggests that the entire increase in the prison population from 1980 to 2001 can be explained by sentencing policy changes. And so she goes on to note, not only is the person's life completely disrupted and potentially ruined by being put in prison, she says on page 192, once a person is labeled a felon, he or she is ushered into a parallel universe in which discrimination, stigma, and exclusion are perfectly legal, and privileges of citizenship such as voting and jury service are off limits. So it's been argued, for instance, that Black Americans tend to be Democrats. They tend to vote Democrat. And so if you, through these measures, stop this large group of people from voting, you can start to shift how votes are going to be counted and the governments that are going to be elected. So there's a whole, obviously, you need to read the book to get the whole argument, but she's making this very convincing argument that essentially, in certain ways, very little has changed since the days of Jim Crow. And so as I said, she wrote this book as a way to intervene in this situation, and she was extremely, extremely successful. But of course, the issues are ongoing. There has been a drop in the incarceration rate in the US, but as you will well know, there's a huge pushback going on in the United States right now. As I said at the beginning of the lecture, race theory is inherently political and activist. It comes out of almost all the thinkers are active in community as well. It's not meant to just be theory. And so there's a kind of a feedback loop that goes on with activism back into theory. And so Black Lives Matter has probably been the most important movement in the last 15 years or so. And so it describes itself as a decentralized political and social movement. So that idea of not having leaders, and I had heard this before and it makes sense, that in the civil rights movement, the leaders of like Malcolm X and Dr. Martin Luther King were assassinated. And so Black Lives Matter on a certain level consciously does not have overt leaders, right? So it's a mass movement. Aims to highlight racism, discrimination, racial inequality experienced by Black people in the United States and to promote anti-racism. Its primary concerns are police brutality and racially motivated violence against Black people. And so one of the defining incidents in this movement was, I'm sure many of you are aware, the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis in 2020. And his cold-blooded murder was filmed, and so it was able to be shown around the world, and it caused protests to erupt all around the world, and including in North Bay. And so I wanted to include this to show the way with Black Lives Matter, because the African diaspora is so broad, these ideas make sense also in a Canadian context. Now, clearly the history is different in Canada, but nonetheless, the idea of police brutality and racial discrimination is the same. And so I actually attended this protest, and I was amazed at the number of people. So there were over 1,000 people. That's huge for a North Bay protest. And so the whole community came out. I was very, very touched by it, actually. And so they gathered outside North Bay City Hall. And so we can see the way that these mass movements are again, and we talked about this with feminism. There's the sort of the activist mass movement, and then there are the thinkers, and often they're one and the same. The thinkers are also part of activism. I want to circle back now to Dionne Brand, who I introduced at the very beginning of the course with the idea of alternative narratives. And Brand, who's a poet, an essayist, a novelist, an academic, activist, she her broader themes are the Black diaspora. Being Trinidadian Canadian, she has a specific lens through the West Indies, and I think this is something very important to note, that in the Canadian case, many Black people come from a West Indian background, and so it's a very different history. And so I've noticed and I've heard it that during Black History Month in Canada, they're often talking about Americans, so which is very perplexing. So that obviously needs to change. And so Dionne Brand comes from this very specific Trinidadian background, and in her work, she talks about it a lot. So her mother left Trinidad to find work in England, as many did. And so she was basically raised by her grandparents. And then she went to university in Canada and then settled in Canada. So this idea of this diaspora sort of being far flung across the globe, often because of economics. So Brand is extremely political. She fits within. I don't know if she would call herself a Marxist, but she's definitely a left wing theorist. But like Cornel West and Dubois, she takes culture very seriously. Of course, she herself is a poet and a writer, and looks at how narrative shapes how we view these issues, and who is writing and who has the power to write. And so kind of taking back the pen. And I'll be talking about this when we get to Edward Said, so this actually bridges really nicely into the section on colonialism, that through television, through film, etc., how are other cultures presented. And so she's centrally concerned with that. I want to end by looking at Dionne Brand's latest book, Salvage, and she's very prolific, and I've read a number of her works, and she's never one to shy away from very difficult questions and difficult history, but she often does it in this very poetic way. So the form is very radical in the way that she's attempting to engage with these political ideas and economic ideas, for instance. And so, as I said, she takes narrative very seriously. And so in the beginning of this book, she's looking at a painting, I believe it's by an African painter, and it's of a boat. And she says, even a wrecked and wretched boat still has all the possibilities of moving. So I'm going to come back to that. There are many shipwrecks now. They are tended by border and security regimes. They end in loss of lives. And so she's saying this is ongoing. I suspect many of you will know of all the different, there are many different channels where people are trying to immigrate, say from North Africa to Italy. Often they drown. They're taken advantage of by people for money. This happens also at the border of America into Mexico. So this idea that these people face drowning, they face border guards, they often face death. And so she says these earlier shipwrecks contained the precarious too, the enslaved. So she's linking it back to those other ships, the slave ships of the Atlantic slave trade. So all these precarious lives who are on these ships. But most of the stories that arrive from this time and propel modern adventurers are ones of lost wealth and treasure. And so she's bringing in that economic argument and the way that we are told these stories, that certainly when I was learning it in middle school, it was all about, the voyages of discovery and Columbus and how amazing that was. So that idea of going to the quote unquote new world and finding wealth and treasure, and not talking about these other ships that are also part of that project. So on page 174, she writes, "It is unbearable for me to watch any television show or popular film about Black people within the framework of the capitalist machine making images of Blackness. Those are the scenes of the deepest interruption, because those are the scenes where a promise of self-observation, of characterization is offered and withdrawn quite commonsensically. I say commonsensically because all representations within this machine take the capitalist form. And even when these images supposedly resist, inevitably they must assimilate into the form." So she's saying that within the forms that we create narrative, there's no way to give an authentic picture of her culture or history. And she's, as I said, taking narrative very seriously. This whole work is about particularly kind of English fiction of the 1800s that she grew up reading in Trinidad and a British colony. And she is certainly not throwing aside a lot of this literature. She's allowing it to exist in tension, but she is saying that she can't read it. She can't read it and just say, oh, what pretty dresses and how amusing, because she's thinking about this landed gentry, where did they get their money? So if we look at Jane Eyre, for instance, we're told that the woman in the attic is from the West Indies, right? So there's these allusions throughout that literature to where the money's coming from, but no one explicitly is saying it's coming through enslaved labor. So she's saying, as a Black person, she can't ignore that. So at the very end, she writes, I have been trying to think of how one is made and how one makes oneself. I have been thinking that one is made through events, historical, familial, known and unknown. One is made also by what one reads, by what one experiences. All this underpins how one comes to know oneself, and one is made through the action, realization, and an analysis that constructs a self. One is made by works of literature, and one is made through and by narrative. So that's her larger argument here. And so obviously these topics are very challenging, but unless I'm reading this completely wrong, I just want to come back to that, this quote here. Even a wrecked and wretched boat still has all the possibilities of moving. So I see this optimism here that despite all the terrible history, this boat can still sail. And so she's still writing, and I have to say that it's pretty hard to write out of despair. Writers, especially writers like Brand, are writing out of some kind of hope and optimism. And so I think it's an important note to sound at this moment, that even a wrecked and wretched boat still has all the possibilities of moving.